So today is September 13, 2019. My name is Blair Williams. I'm here today at the Cumberland County Historical Society with Wolford Herman. So thank you, Mr. Herman, or Wolford, for coming in. The first question I always like to ask people is, how did your family come to reside in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania?
On my mother's side, the family was named Lehn, L-E-H-N, and one of William Penn's grandsons, I think it was, granted a square mile in Northumberland Township to the Lehn family. The only records that I can find is a John Lehn, who was born in 1821, I think it was. I looked at the tombstone in Salem Stone Cemetery just the other day, wrote some articles down concerning it. He had two sons. One was named Solomon Washington Lehn, and the other was John. They were about 8 years apart. Solomon Washington Lehn was the first son, but did not get the John Lehn name. Solomon Washington was my great-granddad. My grandmother was Emma Barbara Lehn, the only heir in that of that family. John, other son, John, had three daughters. Two of them died as youth. I think one was 5 and one was 8. The story of the family is that they had scarlet fever. The third one lived. It was Laura Lehn, married Harry Brown. And of course, she was my grandmother's cousin. Now, we lived on adjoining farms. The farms are south of the Blue Ridge Mountain, the northernmost point of Cumberland County, in Northumberland Township, and lie between Crane's Gap and Wagner's Gap. I have never been able to determine exactly the east and the west boundaries of this 1 square mile. But all these farms in that area were eventually given off in partials to children, which were girls, and they married another name, of course. My grandmother was telling me the Barleys, the Mellingers, the Wearies, Wagners were a part of that family. I knew from personal experience the Barleys because Clara Barley married Cal Walters. Cal Walters and her, the Barley lady died, and Colonel Stipes bought that. The property's still there. A guy by the name of Watts owns it now. The homestead where I was born and raised is still in the family, and it was given by the Penns in 1732, the year George Washington was born. My cousin died in 14, and his widow and one daughter, eventually the heirs of this farm. I expect it to be sold. It will not be a part. But it was in the Lehn name because my grandmother married a Wolf, and they kept it Lehn, Lehn, Lehn. I can't find any records prior to all this, and as I said, I don't know the boundaries of it, east and west, but I suspect top of the mountain is the north, and 1 mile, 1 square mile, 640 acres. To me, that is quite an interest. I always loved history and everything, and I'm 90 years old, and I know that there isn't anybody else in the community that know about this property like I do. What is in the records of the courthouse and historical society, I do not know. I know there was some plots of ground and so forth, mountain land, that were given off and recorded and so forth, but other than that, I have no records of it. But I was born in 1929, March 22nd, and raised on that farm My grandparents lived at one end of the farmhouse, and my parents and I lived, my sisters lived in the other part of the farmhouse. Eventually, when my grandparents died or went into nursing home, half of the house was available, and my wife and I, who were now living in York, moved here and rented it from my uncle, who bought my mother's share out of the deal and told her she could live there as long as she lived. I went to school at Evergreen Grove, one-room school for 8 years. At the start in 35, fall 35, when I was 6 years old. And during the war years, Mrs. Evelyn Wagner was gracious enough to allow us older boys to have classes till noon and then go help the farmers because they were hurting for laborers during the Second World War. When I was around 11 or 12, I picked up potatoes at Roy Sugar's farm for $1 a row. I helped them fill silos, I helped to thrash, helped make hay, cut corn, husk corn, whatever needed to be done, besides working at the farm at home. In 1935, my grandparents had sale, and my dad farmed the farm after that until 63 when he had sale. Prior to this taking over the farm there, my father was married to a Blanche Menser. And in 22, my sister, half-sister, Emma, was born. 2 years later, Blanche was pregnant again and had a baby girl, and they both died. Dad took Emma to his mother's and sister's New Kingston area, the Herman family, and they kept her for a couple of years, raised her and so forth, till Dad remarried my mother, Pearl Wolf, who was the daughter of Barbara, who was the daughter of Solomon. If you get the drift of each generation through that. So I had another sister, Mara, who was 3 years older than me, and then Emma. We all went to the Evergreen Grove School and eventually the Carlisle High School. Graduated there. Emma graduated at the age of 16 and went to Indiana, Pennsylvania State Teachers College in a home ec course during the war years. I recall some trips to some friends in Altoona and stayed, and then on to Indiana to take Emma to school and go get her on occasion. My sister Mara hooked up somehow with the Army nurse corps and took her training in nursing in the York Hospital. Graduated from that in 47, the same year I graduated from high school. My sister Emma graduated a year or two before that from Indiana. At the time, they were rationing tires and shoes and gas and food and all this sort of thing. And my parents could not make the trip to Indiana to her graduation, I remember, because the tires were too bad in the car. The Pattersons lived on Route 641. Bry Messers were there, Mrs. Patterson's wife's, Mrs. Patterson's family, her parents. And Lewis Patterson, who graduated my class high school, is still living, and he was a surgeon in Harrisburg Hospital. I talked to him recently after our 1947 class stopped their senior reunions. I've seen him twice in the past year. They lived in Indiana when my sister was out there. Mr. Patterson was a county agent. They would come home, excuse me, for Christmas and bring my sister along home sometimes. The Pattersons tended Carlisle Market the same as my parents did. During the war years, we took a lot of produce and meats and so forth to the market. Harry Brown, my mother's cousin's husband, was a pretty good butcher in addition to farmer. And he and Dad would raise a bunch of hogs. And every other week they'd kill one of them would kill 6 hogs, and then next week the other one would kill 6 hogs. I helped with the butchering when I was old enough, carrying boiling water to scald them and getting the hair off and so forth, and doing the whole procedure, cutting them up, cutting lard, making scrapple, making sausage, making pudding. The hams and shoulders were cured, and they go to market, where the market house in Carlisle, the square, which was granted by the Penns for the farmers in the area and stolen by the Carlisle Borough, condemned, and they couldn't tear it down in 1952. They had an awful time demolishing the condemned building. By this time, I was in the Army. I was inducted. I'm getting a little ahead of it. After high school in 47, I went to work in a sawmill in the North Mountain for Frank Fry and his son Fred. He had a sawmill located just east of the big curve on Wagner's Gap Road towards Long's Gap Road, and for 2 weeks we would saw trees down, and then 2 weeks we would take a team and a tractor we had there and drag the logs into the sawmill, and then we'd get a sawyer. Fry would get a sawyer, an old man with a beard, chewed tobacco a lot, I remember, from Prairie County. I can't recall his name. But he could run that sawmill and get the necessary lumber. He was real expert at it. I off-bared a lot of that, in addition to cutting trees and dragging them in. On one occasion, Frank Fry, who was very rough, nasty, did a lot of cursing, was cursing the man who was working with me, who was Freddie, his son, Frank's son's brother-in-law. He called him everything but a white man. At lunchtime, and there was a lot of snow, we had a little pot-bellied stove, we were in a little lean-to we had there to eat our lunch. We were toasting our sandwiches, and it occurred to me that I would not put up with that nature, that atmosphere and so forth. So I told them, to anyone here that might be concerned, I'm telling you right now, that if anyone curses me like Frank just did to, I think his name was Bill, and I can't handle him with these two, I will pick up a 2x4 and I will beat the living daylights out of him. Frank never cursed me. But on another occasion, he couldn't get his team to pull. The log that they were trying to drag was pretty big, and they would not move. He was screaming and yelling and cursing at the horses, and I said to Freddie, "Get your dad to let me drive the horses." Well, he wouldn't do it, but Freddie finally convinced him, and they said, "Well, go ahead and try." I had an apple in my pocket, I took the apple out and used my pocket knife to cut it in half and fed a horse. There was 2 horses, there was a team of gray, each a half of the apple, grabbed the check lines and said, "Get up," and they took off. From that time, I had charge of the team and drove Winter 47. By spring, things were getting a little different, and I wanted to get away from the sawmill. And a friend was working for a contractor in the Camp Hill area, and he asked me if I would come there and take a job with him. And I did. I got a job there as labor, making $1.25 an hour. Now this was spring of 48. I worked till 49 and then took a job with the Carlisle Poultry and Egg, Walter Weidley, driving an egg truck in the Franklin, Adams, Cumberland, York County area. There were 3 of us that had trucks, and we each had a different route. During the winter, we'd have to put chains on and get into the farm lane, and we'd have all kind of difficulty. We had 30 dozen cartons of eggs to carry from the basement to the truck and stack them in the truck, leave the empties. On one occasion in the Franklin County area near Greencastle, I had just gotten a new customer, and when I pulled up and taking 2 empty crates into the porch, the dog jumped off the porch straight at me. I held the crates in front of me, deflecting the dog, wrote out the price and the check and so forth for the eggs, and then carried a crate of eggs out to the truck, dog following me. Take 2 more back, deflected the dog again, brought more eggs out. I had, I think, 6 or 8 crates of eggs to get out of there, and by this time I had a lot of empties there. I had to get back also and load in the truck. One of the weird experiences on the egg route. I think I could almost write a book about some of the things that happened there while I was on the egg route. Cattle were out at different places, and I'd help the farmer get the cattle in. On one occasion, the farmer and I went into the basement to get the eggs and wrote out the check, and his wife was in there with a washing machine and a wringer washer. When we went out to the truck, she started screaming, and we went running in, and I hit the release, freed her arm, which was raw by this time. He loaded her up and took her to the Chambersburg Hospital. This was in the west of Roxbury near Strasburg, Upper Strasburg. There were many occasions where I helped dig people out of the snow and put their chains on and all that sort of thing. And December of 49, I had recently bought a 46 Chevy automobile from Marty Wise, who was running a gas station on Route 11. That's where we gassed up our trucks for the Carlisle Poultry and Egg. He bought this car from an Army officer, and I bought it from him and went to Potter County hunting for doe the last day of the season. There was 5 of us in the car. We got 4 deer that day, put them on the front fender of the car, and hauled them home to the farm where I was raised, hung them up, skinned them out the next day, and shared the meat. By the next year, we had decided that the group of us that were hunting that way, there were several others, some of the Weibleys and some Finkenbinders. I can't remember all the people. We borrowed a tent and pitched it just south of Cross Forks at a farmer's field called, his name was Crawford. It was at a footbridge over the Kettle Creek to an island. On that island was a well casing burning of gas. We warmed our hands there many times. Another footbridge across the other side off the island and then into the mountain. We hunted there using that tent and came home that year. The next year we sent the tent up on a Saturday with the idea of setting it up and having it ready with our blankets, our cots, the food. George Olsch and Lynn Weibly drove the truck Saturday morning to do all this setting up, while the other three of us who were running egg routes were running Monday's route on Saturday. When we got into that, it started to rain. By noon, it was freezing rain on the windshield. I'll never forget the drive from Shippensburg to Carlisle that night with my head out the window because it was iced up and the wiper was not clearing that I could see. When I unloaded the truck, my grandpa was in at the Molly Pitcher Hotel. For some reason, I had to take him home that evening. It was close to 6 o'clock and I had a date with a young lady and we went to a movie. We went home from that, and the next morning, 13 of us were lined up at Route 944 and 34 at Carlisle Springs to make the trip to Potter County. It was snowing hard, and there was about 6 inches on the ground. We spent all day driving to Potter County. We crisscrossed portions of the state, we crossed rivers and had water coming in the running boards of the cars on one occasion, and got to Driftwood. There was a short distance, or Clearfield, it was a Clearfield, but there wasn't any snow, everything was ice. We drove into town and we were about out of gas. Now this was mid-afternoon by this time. There was 4 people in my car, and the car following me had 2. The car, I was driving a 50 Chevy, which I had bought in February that year with the regular summer tires. I was able to speed enough down the hill to make it up the next hill to get around many of these places. Walter Weibly, the owner of Carlisle Poultry and Egg, was in the back seat with me. Emmett Ober was in the front, and Charlie Shoemaker was in the back with Walter. Ernie Ober was with Clyde Keck in a 42 Chevy Club Coupe and had to stop and put chains on 2 or 3 times. We got to Clearfield, everything was iced up, and we were out of gas. We pulled into a gas station where electric was off, and they had a hand pump. A line of traffic, hunters going north. When we got our turn and got gas with that hand pump and left there and started out about 4 miles out of town, ice no longer, just snow. Blinding snow when a truck would come your way and you're off the road. It had been plowed. I pulled in one place to the side where the snowplow had plowed and got stuck. Got out, and Clyde Keck was just ahead of me with Ernie Ober and looking down about an 8-foot embankment that they had stopped, luckily, before they went over. They decided that I should go first because he had chains and I had a car with fender covers, and that was all iced up. I had borrowed a set of chains from Marty Weibly. It didn't have money to pay for them. I told him if I used them, I would pay him. If I didn't, I'd give him back when I got home. He agreed to that. And we took off and got to a Kettle Creek above Renova, just south of Cross Forks. The bridge was washed out. There was a few kids. By this time it was 6 in the evening and it's dark. There was a couple kids and an old bearded gentleman there that told us if we went back just a short distance, there was a dirt road that went over the mountain to Gailton, and we could come back to Cross Forks, rerouting around. It was about 12 miles, and it was all mountain. We went back and took one look at that. There wasn't any tracks on it. All you could see was clearing that there weren't any trees there. Down a little dip and then up the hill. I started up the hill in second gear, as much as I could get out of it. We made 2 or 3 of these type of humps, and then the car started spinning. Everybody bailed out and started pushing, and I was on the driver's door open, a throttle that you could pull out, had the car in second gear, pushing also, and we made it over that hill. And I yelled at the guys, "Catch Keck," when he comes by, and I kept going. I made it to the top of the mountain. It's blowing and snowing, and I'm sitting up there, and I'll never forget, as long as I keep my mind, listening to 2 half-hour radio programs, R. Miss Brooks and Jack Benny, wondering if anyone was ever going to come up there or if I was ever going to get out of there. Eventually, the car pulled up behind me, and there was 2 or 3 following him. They had stopped and put chains on, and now they were coming. So we took off out the mountain towards Gailton. We didn't go far till there was a line of cars coming the other way. But they were smart enough to know the area. I didn't. They were on the wrong side of the road, which was an embankment up. I was on the side of the embankment down. We stopped and surveyed the situation. 3 or 4 cars approaching us, 3 or 4 cars behind me. We determined that if we all got out but the driver and held the lower side of my car, I could slip past them in the snow, which I did. Went out a piece ways and came back to help hold all the. We got everybody past that was headed that way and took off for Gailton. Got into Gailton and turned and came back down to Cross Forks where we were to have the tent pitched. There's no tent in the field. Across the road was a deputy game warden who we had permission to pitch the tent. I knocked on his door at 9 o'clock that night. We had left Carlisle at 8 a.m. We were driving through this snow and these conditions. He did not believe me I was from Carlisle. I had to show him my driver's license. He says, "You can't get here from Carlisle. The roads are closed, the bridges are out, and all this stuff." He had a bunch of tenants that were coming there from Pittsburgh, guests that were supposed to be renting his upstairs. He decided he would let us for $6 each a night, and his wife would give us breakfast, pack us a lunch, and give us supper. For 2 days, we could stay there $6 a day, which we did. And then Tuesday night, we headed back and had to make the trip back to Gailton again. In Gailton, I went to a gas station and I put my car on a lift and ran water and got ice picks out. Well, I cleared the ice out from behind the wheels, around the wheels, because there was no longer any spring action. It was just humming and the tires was all packed. Well, that worked okay for a few miles, but that was futile. Before we got home, it was packed again that way. But we drove home. We didn't have to traverse quite as much coming home. I forget how we got home, but we got home about 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, years later, I had a four-wheel drive Bronc that if these situations were to occur, I wouldn't have ventured with that four-wheel drive to have made that trip. But there is one living member of that group that was there named Ernie Ober, who lives on Trindle Road, if anyone would like to verify our trip on that occasion. Okay, that was December's hunting season of 1950. In February the 8th, I was inducted into the Army. Dad took me to the Carlisle Post Office, where we met a bus. I knew one guy. We had a bus load to New Cumberland, Mervyn Sheriff, who's now dead. We went to New Cumberland, were inducted there, loaded on a bus and sent to Harrisburg Railroad, and got on a train and went to Fort Meade. Arrived there 10 or 11 at night, went through a Army building getting issued uniforms, blankets, and everything for the night. The next day or two, I'm not sure which, they had orders written, and I was sent with a lot of others to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Our sheriff went to Rucker. I never saw him again until we got back from Korea. At Fort Meade for a few days, and then at Fort Jackson, I was assigned to the Dixie Division, the 31st Division. I was from National Guard from Alabama and Mississippi. They were activated and given 30 days until the activation became in effect. During that 30 days, they were told, they were about half strength, these National Guard guys. They were told to try to recruit any 17-year-old senior, offer them a PFC stripe to join. When it actually was activated at the end of that 30 days, they gave them a corporal stripe, whether they were in 1 day or 20 days. They were our cadre for our training at Fort Jackson. We were in Tent City. There was 2 other divisions that had the barracks at Fort Jackson. The National Guard outfit I was assigned to was D Battery, Anti-Aircraft Artillery, 104th Battery, 104th Battalion, 31st Division. Captain Neal was my commanding officer. He ran the SO oil distribution, gas and oil, in Russellville, Alabama. There was 12 sets of brothers in C Battery that I was in, not D Battery, C Battery, 104th, 31st Division. 12 sets of brothers. I don't know how many cousins, brother-in-laws, and relatives. 2 of the officers were his truck drivers or mechanics, a couple of the sergeants likewise. We had a first sergeant who was the most uncouth man I have ever met in my life. I am not exaggerating when I tell you, if he said 5 words to you, 6 were cursing. He had 3rd grade education. When it came to calling a roll for payroll, when he got to Sergeant Brown, he'd follow him out and have him call the names because he couldn't pronounce them. He could do one thing well, 2 things. He could call cadence and march men extremely well. The second thing, he could drink beer and get in fights almost every night. superior to anybody I'd ever known. I had many occasions when I requested sergeants or corporals to take off their stripes and go down in the woods with me and we'd settle our disagreements. No one offered to do it. I became pretty angry, pretty mean. I weighed around 180 pounds when I was drafted. I was on the track team at high school and ran the quarter mile and a mile relay, which was another quarter mile, and threw the javelin. I ran the 100 around 11 seconds, but was not good enough to be in any meets for the 100. I was in pretty good shape because I had ridden my bicycle 7 miles from my home to Carlisle High School, except in the most extreme weather conditions when I walked to a neighbor and rode to Carlisle at 6 a.m. and played ping pong and shot pool at the YMCA until it was time to go to the Lamberton building. So when we were out in the motor pool marching and doing double times and so forth, I could usually outrun anybody in the outfit, or by this time there was 180 guys. They brought in enough draftees and RAs to bring them up to strength. One of the guys from Alabama was a young man around my age, or just a little older, named Bentley Duncan. He was 6'4" and was a basketball player for the University of Auburn. His brother was a sergeant in the outfit. Bentley and I became close friends, and we took the lead when it came to running around the motor pool, and would be way ahead of everybody, and the sergeant would make us, plus all the other guys, take another lap. They were very angry at us for this. In the summer, in the company streets after duty, we played a lot of football. I never played football in high school because my parents needed me at home to help with the harvesting, and my mother was afraid I would get injured. Our minister at the time was Reverend Messner, who was a football player and tried to convince my mother to let me play, but never allowed to. But on the company streets, we played tag football till somebody would get roughed up a little bit, and then they'd want to play tackle. So we would play tackle. Being pretty quick, I was usually the fullback carrying the ball. Many times I was tackled and injured to the point where my knee hurt so much I couldn't hardly hobble around on it, but I was too dumb to quit. We went to Camp McCall, North Carolina, for maneuvers. Prior to that, we got a pass in May to come home. 4 of us Pennsylvania boys got on the train in Columbia, South Carolina to Washington, D.C. Paul Shellhammer, who's still alive and lives in Shermanstown, Herb Dorney in Allentown, who's now passed away, and Red Driscoll from Pittsburgh. I have no idea whatever happened to him. He was going to Notre Dame when he was drafted. He was in athletics. He was really in good shape. I saw him do 600 push-ups to set a new record at Fort Jackson at one occasion. We boarded the train in May after basic. There was a real pretty little girl there from South Carolina with a lot of luggage, and we helped her bring that to Washington. She was coming to see her boyfriend, who she was engaged to, at Annapolis. When we got to the train station, we needed a taxi to get to the railroad station. A black man there, a taxi driver, offered to take us to the bus, but he told us, I think it was around 3 a.m., that there wasn't a bus for another couple hours. I will take you to Harrisburg if you have X amount of dollars. I can't remember. We didn't have that much. He said, go over there to a restaurant. We dropped the girl off at the bus station, and we went in and with him. And he said, go to a restaurant, get yourself something to eat. I'll try to round up some more. He took my name, Herman. We're sitting in this restaurant eating breakfast, and 2 Marines walked in and said, Herman, your taxi's out here. I had seen this one Marine at the roller skating rink. I didn't know his name, but he looked familiar. He was from Dillsburg. We went out, got in the taxi. I was in the middle, the 6 of us in the taxi. It was a 51 Chevy. And we started out of Washington on Route 15. Just a few miles, and he was going to sleep and nodding and almost off the road, and I punched him. What's going on? What's the matter? Don't you know what you're doing? And he said, I'm an orderly at Walter Reed Hospital. I worked all night. I'm awfully tired. I said, pull this thing off to the side and let me drive. Never thinking he would, but he did. We got in the taxi and headed towards Carlisle. The louder he snored, the faster I drove. When we got to Dillsburg, I stopped and dropped the 2 Marines off. Never saw them again. Don't have any idea what their names were to this day. Drove to Rossmont area on Route 15 where Paul Shellhammer lived on a farm. Stopped there, and he and I got out. The taxi driver took Herb Dorney to Harrisburg to get a bus to Allentown. Paul and I went to his dad's farm. He got his dad's car and brought me to Carlisle to Market House where my parents were tending market. By 2 o'clock, that was Saturday. By 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon, I had my car, and the Dorneys brought Herb, Shallhammers brought Paul, and we headed for Fort Jackson. We had to be there 6 o'clock Monday morning. Now, there was no 95 then. It was just Route 1, 15 and Route 1. We scurried down to Fort Jackson, got there in time, about 5 or 6 in the morning, and went through all our procedure in the military and so forth for a few more weeks. And then we were having maneuvers at Camp McCall. They called it the Southern Pines Maneuvers for the Dixie Division. I asked Captain Neal if I could drive my car to Camp McCall and take some of the buddies along. They were going in convoy. He says, yes, when you get there, wait for us, and you'll take your car to the motor pool and give me your keys. Sergeant Colburn was the 1st platoon sergeant. Sergeant Pyler was the 2nd platoon sergeant. I was in the 2nd platoon. Sergeant Colburn had his car there. He and I were the only 2 in the outfit that drove our personal cars and took some buddies with us. When we got to Camp McCall, ahead of the convoy, Colburn was all upset because we'd have to turn our keys over to the captain. He was ranting and raving about that. When the convoy got there and the captain, and they fell us out in formation, and the captain gave us directions that we were to take our cars to the motor pool. It was about 6 miles away. And they'd send a truck to pick us up, bring us back. I expected Colburn to talk to him about it. Well, he didn't. So I did. Now, prior to all this, I had spent an awful lot of time on KP because I was a rebel. and I made it known in no uncertain terms that I did not like the military and that particular National Guard. When I voiced my opinion to Captain Neal, I remember the words I used: "Sir, when I was drafted, my car wasn't." He stood about 3 inches away from me and lectured me about him being in charge and me not, and that I would take the car. It would go to the motor pool. The next day was going to be a Saturday. We were going to get a pass. He would give me the keys. I would take it off the base, and he didn't ever want to see it in that book. Now, Camp McCall had no buildings except a theater and a PX. Everything else was tents. We were a few miles from Fort Bragg, and we roamed the Southern Pines area digging our half-tracks in. Well, I took my car to the motor pool. I came back and gave him the keys. The next morning, I'm getting twisted here. That next day, then, we got a pass, and we went to Southern Pines in Sanford, North Carolina. Got a hotel room. Had to be back by midnight. When we got back midnight, I went to the day room, the day tent. The corporal there wanted my keys, and I said no. The captain said I was to give him the keys. I wouldn't give it to him. And the next morning, when we were in line to eat breakfast, the officers came out and went and set their tables. I got out of line, went over, took my keys, and tossed them on the table in front of Captain Neal. He never said a word except pick them up and threw them back at me. He says, "You won't be needing these for several weeks." That was the end of that. But every time there was any duty to be pulled from any one of the sergeants or whatever, Herman was the first guy named. One of the occasions when I was on KP, right after I got to Fort Jackson, the sergeant who was in charge of the kitchen and so forth, after we ate breakfast, called me aside and told me to go wherever I needed and find some gravy stretcher. He had me pegged for the dunce of the outfit. I left and went to headquarters and went to D Battery and played ping pong and shot pool all day with some other guys that were around there. Came back at 11 o'clock at night and walked in and told the sergeant, "I've been all over this base hunting gravy stretcher and I can't find any." He had a great big laugh, but I had an easy day. On one other occasion, the first sergeant's brother-in-law, who was a drunk that seemed to never have any duty but a latrine duty, I went to take a shower in the latrine at midnight. Nobody else there. I was all soaked up, and something told me to turn around and look, and when I did, he was standing over me with a knife. I grabbed his arm, soapy and all, twisted it, got the knife out of his hand. Sergeant Rogers came walking in the door. I handle first threw it to him and said, "Take this thing before I make him eat it." Larry King, one of my buddies, came in the door. I don't know what would have happened had he not. That was much of my experience with the National Guard from Russellville, Alabama. When I was drafted, it was for 21 months. 3 months later, they added 3 months to it, making us a 2-year deal. The 31st Division had the luxury of legislatures working in Alabama and Mississippi to pull strings that the 31st would never be shipped overseas intact. Truman's name was not on the ticket in those two states. Thurman was the candidate during that election of 48. So whenever the time came that they had less than 6 months to go, they started writing orders on us guys who filled ranks who had more than 6 months to go overseas. As a consequence, when I boarded the boat in Pittsburgh, California, Camp Stoneman to go to Korea, I had 6 months and 12 days. Had I stayed in the States 12 more days, according to the regulations at that time, I would have not had to go. I got a pass. I'm getting ahead of my story. In Fort Jackson, my good friend Larry King from Texas and another friend from Oklahoma, Ernie Wheeler, had been downtown in Columbia and met two nurses. They dated them a few times and had to use buses and taxis and so forth. So I had a car there. They wanted me to take them and they would get me a date and we'd make it 6 of us going on a date. So they got a date for me with a young lady named Sue Heatley. I had one date with her, didn't particularly care for her, and told them I didn't want to go anymore. So they asked around and asked this Vivian Cooley if she was one of the girls they were dating, if she would get a date for me. And she said she would. And I was introduced to Ruth Owens, a blue-eyed blonde, pretty as a picture, from Georgia. Well, for me, it was love at first sight. For her, it wasn't. But we dated for a while, and this was in October. And we were going to go to Fort Jackson to fire the 40-millimeter cannons to Camp Stewart, Georgia, where they had a bigger firing range. Fort Jackson firing range wasn't big enough. It was okay for the 50 calibers and the turrets, but the 40-millimeter cannon, they had a firing range at Camp Stewart, Georgia. So we went to Georgia just a little before Christmas. While there on New Year's Eve, I was playing basketball the last day of the year. Somebody shot the ball and missed, and I went up to catch it. Obviously popped my knee out of joint, landed on it, and within 5 minutes it swelled my right knee to the size of my head. They cut my fatigues off. They got me in the hospital, and the doctor says this is going to hurt. Grabbed my heel and my toe and put it in joint, and then went to operate. I would not let them operate because everyone was having a stiff knee. At that time, they had no knowledge of how to operate on a knee. I convinced them and did not have the knee operated and stayed in the hospital for a couple, probably 2 or 3 weeks till the outfit was leaving to go back to Fort Jackson. And I was on crutches and they released me to go back with the outfit. Now, prior to all this, I was the gunner on the half-track because I was the quickest guy in our squad to mount the vehicle. We did an about face. The order to mount the vehicle, the first step was the bumper, or the half-track. The second was the hood, the third was the roof, and the fourth was in the turret. We had 4 50 caliber machine guns. They were fun shooting down the drones and the banners that they pulled behind planes at the firing ranges, but I could no longer handle that. I spent an awful lot of time on KP because I wasn't in the hospital. I was back at Fort Jackson on crutches until the knee swelling went down and I was able to hobble around. And the one favor they did for me, I did not have to march on the 3 and 5 mile hikes. I rode a truck in the communications outfit. When the time came that the 31st was now going to be getting out and they started writing orders for them, I was told I was second on the list to go to Korea. A lot of the guys went to Germany, but Larry King and I went the first two. One of the reasons why Sergeant Rogers had us in the day room on occasion and was telling us that we were going to be buying Captain Neal a uniform is against Army regulations for civilian or enlisted men to give a gift to an officer. Larry King and I stirred a ruckus up to the point that Rogers ordered us out of the day room while he tried to convince all the other guys to each give $1 to buy a civilian suit for Captain O'Neill. Well, we created enough havoc that nobody donated. And of course, that was another occasion where Herman was called when KP or garbage duty or guard duty or whatever occasions arose. I was on guard duty on one occasion when a Major Brown drove up in a Jeep and I made him dismount the Jeep, approach me, take off his credentials and lay them on the ground, give me the password, and then he could go. I left him go by. Shortly after that, he conducted a lesson group that we had. He didn't apparently know who it was, but he singled out one guy who did that to him and told all the guys how important it was to perform guard duty in that fashion. Never got any credit beyond that for that, but anyhow, it was quite a big deal to me, and I enjoyed every minute of that. So now, when I got orders to be shipped overseas, and I had just gotten back from Operation Longhorn, which was a maneuvers in Texas. It was an occasion where the Army used the 31st Division as a guinea pig to see if they could fly an entire division somewhere. In 1952, February or March, we flew from Sumter, South Carolina to Temple, Texas. The entire unit, except for tanks, were flown. Tanks were delivered on a train. All day at Fort Sumter, we were in formation waiting, and planes were leaving every 15 minutes and landing every 15 minutes. It was late in the day when I boarded a plane, which was a double-tailed thing. I don't remember the fancy name of the plane, but I was told there was trucks and trailers in the bottom. We were 20 of us troops in the upper deck, upper area. I didn't believe it, so I went down to see before we took off, and sure enough, there was 2 6-by trucks and a 1-ton trailer hooked to each one in the bottom there. We were in what amounted to a sling-type canvas on the side of the plane with a parachute on our back, sitting leaned over this way, given an apple and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich just before we left. I never cared for peanut butter and jelly sandwich, so I gave that to a friend. Remember eating the apple. Boarded the plane. We were sitting I was on the back of the fuselage. Right in front of us, back to back, was two more rows, one facing the fuselage and the other side, like where we were. So there was 4 rows of troops, 20 guys. We were in the air a short time when the guy in front of us threw up all over the floor. Then the next guy, then the next guy. If you can picture setting, flying from Sumter, South Carolina to Temple, Texas, looking at that mess and almost throwing up yourself, you'll get the picture, you'll understand. When we got off the plane, there was a sergeant there and he had the names of everyone. They returned and cleaned the plane. We did our maneuvers in Texas, Longhorn maneuvers, blackouts, all sorts of digging half tracks in the sandy soil, moving to the next position, watching our buddies pick up bull snakes and cracking them like a whip, and their heads would pop off. They were non-poisonous, but they were all over the place. They'd get in your pup tent and be next to you when you woke up, a cold reptile. That's no fun. When we left Texas, we were at San Angelo, Texas. That was the hometown of Larry King, my buddy. But he was not with us because he had gone to a school somewhere. I remember getting a pass. I had lost my pup tent half by this time. We were in sandstorms. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We had very little water, Lister bag to get a canteen full, very little water for cooking, none for washing and cleaning up, but you were sand all over when you'd eat. And I had lost my shelter half, so had another guy. So we were without a shelter half in a sandstorm at San Angelo Airfield this night. We got passes to town, got a hotel room. Went to the hotel room, went to a barber shop first, I'll never forget that. Got a shave and a haircut. The barber was pretty ticked off because he ruined his razor, his clippers, the sand gritting and so forth. Got a shower and spent some time in the hotel room, but called my sisters in New Mexico, which was about 600 miles away. And of course, none of them knew that I was there or anything, so we just had brief conversation on the phone. We went back out to the airstrip that night in that sandstorm, and would you believe the wind fell? And we slept comfortably that night. The next day, the outfit started flying out. By this time, it was spring, and the floods in the Mississippi River were so bad that they had called on the military to help fly and get people to safety and so forth. So they increased the 15-minute plane taking off and plane landing to 7.5-minute plane taking off and landing. I was one of the last there again to leave, but because I got some duty to go out to the railroad tracks and nail the blocks behind the tanks and tie them down with chains onto the train to convoy back. We were going to Camp Atterbury. We got to Camp Atterbury, flew in there late at night. My friend Paul Shellhammer was on a different plane, an engine caught fire in his plane, and they returned and landed and got another plane and got him on that plane. On occasion at Camp Stewart, previously, he was a squad leader, and a man had forgotten to clear the weapon, the 50 caliber machine gun. He got up on it and had a live 50 caliber machine gun with shell, which was hot, tossing it back and forth in his hand, and it exploded. It obviously was partially in the air, but it tore his hand all up, and he was in the hospital while I was in the hospital with my knee. I remember writing letters to his mother because it was his right hand and he couldn't write. We got back to Camp Atterbury safely, and Larry King was back at Atterbury also. We got past to go home. I wanted to come home and get my car. 600 miles from Camp Atterbury to Carlisle. There was a guy in the outfit from Youngstown, Ohio, who had a car which was pretty wore out, but he offered Shellhammer and I a ride to Youngstown, Ohio. We left at noon Saturday, having to be back on Monday morning. We got somewhere near Youngstown, and his car broke down. He got it into a garage, and they were trying to work on it, and we decided we better start hitchhiking. We hitchhiked into Pittsburgh. By the time we got there, it was late at night. We're on the west side of Pittsburgh. It's cold, it's April, just around Easter time. And here we are on the highway hitchhiking. A car came the other direction, went down the road a short distance, turned around and went back, and it was a young guy who had just taken his date home. He says, "Where are you guys going?" We were in uniform. And we said we wanted to get to Irwin, the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And he says, "You're never going to get a ride through Pittsburgh. Do you have any money? I'll take you over to Irwin if you have." And I don't know how many dollars we had, but we gave him the few dollars we had. He accepted it and drove us to Irwin. When we got out, it was about daybreak, snowing flurries and raining slightly. We were hitchhiking there, and a truck came along and picked us up, tractor trailer. I swear it was the slowest truck on the highway. That guy changed gears at every little hill 3 or 4 times. We went to the area of Pittsburgh, or Bedford with him, and he stopped for fuel. We got out and went in to get something to eat, and told him when we got out, we were going to get out on the highway and hitchhike again, but if he came by, please stop and pick us up. He said he would. We were on the ramp, and this Jewish man and wife stopped in a big LaSalle car. Got us in their car, and we flew into the Breezewood exit, and they were getting off there to go to Washington. We got off there and stood there and waited till that same truck came by and picked us up again. At the Carlisle exit, Route 34 is where I wanted to get off. We got off there and crawled over the fence and down onto the road, and a neighbor came by and picked me up, Harry Ronan, and took me home. My parents were at church. It was somewhere around 11 o'clock in the morning. I knew how to get into the house through a series of passageways into a basement and where a key would be, and got in the house. When my parents came home with my car and my grandparents with them. I shocked them by being there. 2 hours and 20 minutes home at that point. Paul Shellhammer's back, and we're in the car heading for Camp Atterbury. When we got to Camp Atterbury, the military was pulling all sorts of stunts. And this Larry King got word that his girlfriend from Columbia, South Carolina, was going to be at a convention in Indianapolis and wanted to know if I would take him to Indianapolis to this hotel where she was staying. Vivian Cooley, the girl that had introduced my wife Ruth to me. We had broken up prior to leaving Fort Jackson. When we met, Ernie Wheeler went along too. The three of us guys went to see Vivian Cooley at this hotel. And while there, she told me that Ruth was still in love with me. I called her and talked to her and told her I would do my best to get to Columbia, South Carolina. Shortly after that, I got a pass and full intention of going to South Carolina. Larry King talked me out of it. He said, "You go home to see your parents. They mean more to you than her." Took his advice and went home. Wrote her a letter. When I got back to Camp Atterbury, while I was on leave, I got word to come back that we were processing to go overseas. So I had to leave early and went back to Camp Atterbury. The outfit had started the processing, and I was a few days behind, and they were trying to hurry me up, and during that, I had all kinds of shots. I had 4 wisdom teeth pulled. I was 12th in line that day when the dentist gave me Novocaine. I waited till all the 12 were taken care of, and when I went in, the Novocaine had wore off. He pulled my wisdom teeth with the assistant telling him, "It is obviously worn off. Can't you tell this guy's suffering?" Got through that ordeal, and I got a pass to go home before we would ship out. Shellhammer and Dorney's wife, we came to Pennsylvania. My sister, who had been a nurse in the Army for a short while, who had graduated from nurses training in '47 when I graduated from high school, had gone to Fort Lewis, Washington, stopped in New Mexico where my other sister lived, visited with her for a while, and met a man which she was engaged to. They got married, and they were home to visit my parents and going back to New Mexico. So they took me to Portales, New Mexico, where I met Larry King and Ernie Wheeler, and we drove. Larry King's cousin was taking us in his car. We drove Route 66, went through Death Valley. I saw a thermometer with a temperature of 146 on the wall at a trading post. We drank everything we could get our hands on that day and rolled the windows up in the car. It was so hot, no air conditioning. Stopped at that trading post on the way out and looked at cars going up the mountain that were heating up. We passed them and went all night. I'm in the back seat in the morning, woke up shivering with nothing but my khaki pants and a t-shirt on and 14-foot snowdrifts outside in the Rockies. Unbelievable for a Pennsylvania boy. We got to Camp Stoneman in time. I had to be there by the 15th. And they picked a bunch of us to be the early forwarding party on the boat the day before the boat was actually loaded. They wanted volunteers. The one time in my life I volunteered because I knew that it was going to be at least KP and it couldn't be anything worse than that. I ended up being a chow guard on the ship. I got to eat an hour before the other guys and stand in the hallways and see that certain compartments took their turns and got in line and kept them in order while they went through the mess hall. About 8 days on the boat till we got to Japan. Went under the Golden Gate Bridge, past Alcatraz and under the Golden Gate Bridge. We were just a short distance out of the harbor into the Pacific Ocean when I felt I needed to go to the head, they call it, in the Navy. I went to this head and opened the door, took one look and decided I didn't need to go to the head. Guys were leaning over the commodes, throwing up. There was a couple occasions where while throwing up, the guy was also shooting feces. What an ordeal. I think I was blessed, like you wouldn't believe, to have been assigned to the Dixie Division and not being in Korea any longer than that. When we got to Japan, Tokyo Harbor, I was there for 23 hours. They fell us out of a building there that was supposed to be a university dormitory where we spent a few hours sleeping and started calling orders for guys where they were going, what outfits they were going to. They called a lot to Okinawa and then said the rest of you are going to Korea and be ready to move out in 20 minutes. So duffel bag. Boarded a boat, went to Incheon, Korea in July of 1952. The 38th parallel had been established by then. We got out of the boat at Incheon and got into a launch of some kind because the harbor is too shallow, they couldn't get to the docks. And we were about a mile out, so we went in this little boat to the harbor, and they put us up in a college building there, one of the few buildings that was standing there at Incheon. Bridges and highways and everything were destroyed. What a mess. The next day, they loaded us on trucks and started us towards Yeongdong-po, which was the 45th Replacement Center just out of Seoul. At Yeongdong-po, I was assigned to the 45th Division, the 104th Anti-Aircraft Sea Battery of the 45th Division, the Oklahoma National Guard. We spent a day or two there, and then we trucked forward. We could hear artillery and asked the driver what's going on up ahead, and he'd say they were being shelled. And we'd say, where's the front lines? And he'd say, over the next hill. We'd go over the next hill, and it was still over the next hill, repeatedly. Eventually got to the 45th Sea Battery, 104th Sea Battery. I can't remember the lieutenant's name there, but he was a gentleman. He was a pretty nice officer. I had not served under an officer at this time that I respected. I hated him with a purple passion from that Dixie Division group. There were no blacks in the Dixie Division. My second platoon sergeant in the 45th was a black man, 6'4", feet twice the size of mine. He was a gentleman. I respected that man. He and I walked in a minefield for a half a day behind Lieutenant Hill, the executive officer of that outfit, stringing wires and setting trip flares. I did not step on a blade of grass that Lieutenant Hill hadn't stepped on. A sergeant followed me with those big feet. I don't think he stepped on a blade of grass that I hadn't stepped on. When we got out of that minefield, Lieutenant Hill said, "You guys take the rest of the day off." We were a bundle of nerves. I remember writing a letter home and a letter to my girlfriend, Ruth. We crossed Korea from the west side to the east in about 6 different encampments in the next few months, ending up on the west side where we could see the ocean and the U.S. ships out there who were bombarding north of the 38th parallel most of the times. Being in communication, we were on the top of the hill, antennas up. We had radios in our half-tracks. Our half-tracks were assigned to regimental combat units. Second platoon had 4 half-tracks. We were the 176th, I think it was, regimental combat unit. The 176th Infantry with the 45th Division. We were used as infantry support because there was no enemy aircraft. The tanks would winch us to the top of the mountain with these half-tracks, and we had firepower like galore behind the infantry when there was a push made. When I got to that outfit, I saw a gunner who had survived. Most of the 45th had been killed on Old Baldy. The mountain had been taken by the U.S. numerous times and retaken by the North Koreans and the Chinese numerous times. For some unknown reason, the South Korean outfit who was on Old Baldy left 12 hours before they were supposed to. The confusion of the military time, they left the mountain vacant of defense when the British were supposed to take it. 12 hours later, the Chinks were there. This gunner told me bodies were 5 feet high. or the 50 caliber were shooting enemy crawling over the defenses and picking up the weapons of the fallen troops. He was one of the few survivors of that 45th, the only one that I got to meet. We moved up into defensive positions and would dig in, and I'd have to go out and string wires. We would lay the wires on the ground, except for a few places where it crossed a road, there would be maybe a pole of some kind to get the wire overhead so the jeeps and the trucks could get by there. Artillery shells would hit the wires, and I'd have to splice them. We'd change the crystals in the radio every few days so that the frequencies were different. Passwords were changed every couple days. My first day on the line, I had a South Korean soldier who was assigned. He had never been in the South Korean army. He was a U.S. soldier, same as me. His name was Chow Tae-young. Just a little guy. I'll never forget him. I slept well when he was on guard duty. He was like a cat. You could not get anything past him. He and I were out checking these wires. He spoke very few American words. We communicated a good bit by sign language. He would help me splice the wires. I would change the crystals in the radios. We were told, and this was one of the things I can never forget or believe that happened. I ate very little sea rations in Korea. We had hot meals on the line. Infantry would bring a truck up, and I was told, since I was assigned to that, to tell the captain or the sergeant that I was there, and he could draw rations for us, and they'd feed us. The first day on the line when I got there in the chow time, the line was sporadic. You did not stand in line close to anybody. Artillery rounds and mortar might wipe out several. When it came my turn, I went to my mess kit, got the food, got the drink, walked away a short distance, and there was a whistle, and everybody around me was hitting the dirt, and all of a sudden a mortar went off and dirt flew, and I hit the dirt then, mess kit and all. I hit the dirt quicker after that. I went back, cleaned up my mess kit, and the sergeant gave me another meal. No time after that did I have a problem hitting the dirt. When I would get back where our second platoon CP was set up, I was in a personnel carrier half-track without quad 50s, just a single 50 caliber machine gun on it. And I was on the radio and the switchboard in that half-track, calling in to headquarters artillery rounds or mortar rounds that were coming in, giving them the date and the azimuths and the elevations and so forth of where this stuff was coming. On one occasion, on Smoke Valley, was a road between two rice paddies that the supply trucks used. we had pots sitting around beside the road, and they were lit. Create a lot of smoke along there. That's why we called it Smoke Valley. The trucks would run by there. If it was windy, it wasn't very effective. This one day I'm sitting there watching this road, and a 6-by and a Jeep went down the road heading south. All of a sudden the Jeep stopped, driver got out, jumped in a rice paddy. The 6-by truck continued. A couple more shells. It seemed like the observer could tell, and he walked those shells down the road. There was an explosion, the truck disappeared. Flames, all sorts of debris. A couple days later, when it was fit to go and look because it was foggy, the only thing we found was the engine block. Like I said, we moved the entire way across the peninsula of Korea. At the east side, it made a sudden northward. If you'll look at the map showing this, we were about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 miles north of the 38th parallel. That's my last position there. It's getting real cold. Through November, we were freezing there because we did not have adequate clothing. But when I got with the outfit in July, we threw uniforms, sweaters, jackets, underwear, gloves, anything you can imagine, boots, into the latrine and shoveled it shut, along with a lot of motor pool gear that the outfit was not supposed to have. It should have been returned in the spring. Socket sets, 3/8, half-inch, 3/4 in cosmoline into the slit trenches and covered them up. That winter we were freezing until we finally started getting sleeping bags, Mickey Mouse boots, gloves. When we stood guard duty, and you stood it, you didn't walk it, we were silhouettes against the sky. If you walked, you were easily observed. 2 hours at a time, I saw temperatures of 10 below, and this was the 38th parallel. I can't believe what the troops, 2 years before, endured in North Korea before I got there. It was getting close, my time to rotate home. So I was called from the 176th Regimental Combat Team back to battalion headquarters, which was about 2 miles back behind the lines. We were having a command inspection one of the first days back there. It was so cold you could hardly stand it, but we all got out there in formation and looked up over the hill and saw a Jeep coming with the officer, a lieutenant colonel, who was supposed to inspect us that day. And suddenly there was a few artillery rounds in that area, and the Jeep turned around and went back. No inspection that day. We had it the next day. I was standing in formation, and he came through the line, and he grabbed my weapon, which was now a carbine. I had a grease gun when I was on with the 176th Regimental Combat Team, a burp gun they called it, 45 caliber, and big long clips. But they took that from me and gave me a carbine that a South Korean U.S. soldier had, and had polished it. It shined like it was stainless steel instead of being blued. When that lieutenant colonel got in front of me, he grabbed my weapon, and I had just been given it 2 days before. It was so filthy dirty inside, I didn't know how to clean it. He took one look at it. He said, "Soldier, if you'd cleaned this gun as good on the inside as you did on the outside, it might work." And tossed it back to me. He said, "If there's a push, it will never be fired." I said, "Sir, I was just given that." And then the captain of the outfit stepped up and said, "He's rotating home, and we just issued him that gun, that weapon." He continued down the line, got to the end of it, gave an order to remove your helmet and helmet liner and the cap that we had on at the time. When he got behind me, he said, "You're letting your hair grow. Why didn't you have a haircut?" I said, "Sir, I'm going home." He almost knocked the soldier down next to me, got out in front of me and gave me a lecture about my haircut, walked away and left. The captain whispered to me, "You're going back to battalion tomorrow. You better get a haircut or you'll never get out of this man's army." The cooks were the ones that gave us haircuts. They did not have time that day. That night, I moved back to battalion with this outfit, and I made sure was hid from him. We continued making a move every day or so, and we're getting back to Yeongdong Po. I got there Christmas Eve. The replacement center that I had been in on the approach to all this mess I was in. We spent most of the night playing cards that night. We were so overjoyed to be there. We were in tents. I remember we played hearts. Quite expert at that. We played a lot of hearts. In the morning, I was one of the last to get up and go to chow because I'd been up so late at night. You would not believe the meal we got on Christmas Day. My mess kit had the turkey, the ham, the mashed potatoes and gravy, the filling, the sweet potatoes, the vegetables heaped, drinking the cup. Might have eaten half of it, went out to clean and throw away into the garbage. The 45th replacement had a chain link fence around it. There was a guard walking, keeping the troops 10 feet away from the fence. You can't believe the unimaginable things that went on in that 10 feet. There was a line of children with snowshoes made from U.S. Army, with snowsuits made with U.S. Army blankets, hiking towards our outfit, begging for the food. I remember pushing a guard away and walking to the chain link fence, motioning for a little girl, holding my tray that she could get her grubby little hand and rake the food off that mess kit into a gallon bucket she was carrying. Tears streaming down my face. I went back to the tent to get my camera. When I came back, they were disappearing back to the village. I didn't get a picture. To my dying day, I'll never get over that experience. I'm not sure whether we spent a couple days there or not, but we moved on into Incheon. We were in the barracks building on New Year's Eve. At 9 o'clock, I'm in line. It is raining, it's about 33 degrees, and we're waiting to board the little boats to go out to the ship. They're unloading off these little launches, troops coming in, and we were harassing them and telling them we would take care of their girlfriends and not worry. And we were there. And at 9 o'clock at night, I climbed the ladder and boarded the Marine Lynx to leave Korea. We stayed in the harbor till about 2 or 3 in the morning because we were getting combat pay for any time that we were in the harbor, and that was considered into the next month. We went to Sasebo, Japan. They unloaded us there, went into a building where we stripped. I had nothing but my wristwatch and my wallet, and were issued new uniforms. They said they were burning our uniforms because of hemorrhagic fever. The rats at the dumps were so bad, we had lots of shooting experience at it, but guys were dying right and left from hemorrhagic fever. They were having a big steak dinner for us when we got all dressed up, and I chose to go to the PX and see if I could buy a set of china for my wife. Wasn't my wife yet, but my fiance. When I got done with all the PX stuff, the steak meal was over. I didn't get any. We stayed there for maybe 4 or 5 days and then started home to Japan, from Japan to America. I wasn't as lucky to be in a child guard. I was just like all the other guys at this point. I think I was the closest guy to being seasick that didn't make it. I ate nothing but saltine wafers, spent most of the time on deck instead of at the chow lines and whatever the Navy called this stuff. Came under the Golden Gate Bridge to Camp Stoneman. They asked us at that point what we wanted to do about our military situation. Due to the fact that we had been the 21-month enlistees and then a 3 months added to it, we were given the opportunity to accept a different type of reserve. National Guard, we could sign up for National Guard. Since we had that, or stay out of it. It was 3 years without it, 5 years if you chose to not be National Guard. I chose the 5 years. Where do you want to go to get out of the service, they said. My first request was Indiantown Gap. My second was Fort Jackson, South Carolina. They sent me to Fort Custer, Michigan. It was colder than blue blazes there. Had no duty of any account. A few days there and wrote the orders and shipped me to Pennsylvania by bus. I left Michigan, arriving in Pennsylvania on January the 31st. On the turnpike, got off at the Carlisle exit, crawled over the fence. I think the same neighbor that had picked me up previous occasion stopped and picked me up and took me home. It was a Sunday. The next day, being Monday, and my license to drive had run out. My dad and I went to Harrisburg and I got my Pennsylvania license, went to a jewelry store, bought a ring, and 6 o'clock that evening I was on my way to South Carolina. I got there at 7, went into the hospital where the nurses stayed and announced that I was there, and Ruth came down, accepted my ring on the 3rd of February. We spent a week together, went to Atlanta to see her brother and his family, came back to Columbia, and I came home with a job to work for my uncle, and Ruth went in a nurse's facility again. She had gone through the training and spent 1 year as a nurse at the hospital. Her mother had died. Her father had died when she was 11 months old. She had 3 brothers, but they were scattered. She didn't know where. On the 21st of March, we were married in Fort Jackson. Went to Daytona Beach on our honeymoon. Came back to Columbia. Her brother and his wife and kids lived in Columbia. Visited with them that day and then came to Carlisle with nothing but her personal effects in the car. She had never been north of North Carolina. She had never met my parents. She's an amazing woman. We've been married 66 years, have 15 grandchildren and 7 great-grandchildren, and blessed by God beyond anything you can imagine. I thank you for your time to endure this situation.
Thank you so much, Wolford, for speaking with me today.